Hi, my name is Blake Atherton, and I'm a senior at Georgetown University in the School of Foreign Service. I study political science and economics, and plan to enroll in Georgetown Law School next fall. Today, we're going to be discussing the new SAT. We'll begin by discussing the writing and language section of the SAT, and techniques for most quickly and effectively answering questions in this section. We'll then go on to the reading section. We'll take a passage presented to us, annotate it deeply and effectively, that will then allow us to, when we answer the questions, find the evidence we need to support with confidence the correct answer. I hope you enjoy. As mentioned, we're going to begin with a section from the writing and language portion of the new SAT. So let's jump right in. So unlike the critical reading section, now known as the reading section, in the writing and language section, you don't need to actually sit down and read the entire passage before you begin. As a matter of fact, it's actually a better idea to just jump right in, and if you encounter a question in which you do need context in order to best answer the question, then you can read the sentences around it. So let's begin with question 12. Let's begin by discussing the writing and language section of the new SAT. Starting with question 12 here. Now, as we'll see in the first question, the new SAT writing section is very interested in ascertaining how well you can connect sentences. This is because understanding how to make a paragraph flow logically can be very indicative of how well you combine ideas to form an argument. And so this is a key skill in writing. So in order to best answer a question about how to combine sentences, we want to first isolate the two sentences by drawing a little line here and reading them independent of one another. So let's draw a little line in between the two sentences provided. The first sentence reads, "His Broadway shows are still performed around the world." And the second sentence is, "They have remained some of the most beloved and acclaimed productions." Now let's go take a look at the options. Option A needs a comma before the word remaining in order to be grammatically correct. His Broadway shows are still performed around the world, remaining some of the most beloved and acclaimed productions. Since we've noticed an error in this answer, we can nix it. Now, since the two sentences are not contradictory to one another, again, they are, his Broadway shows are still performed around the world, and secondly, they have remained some of the most beloved and acclaimed productions, option B does not make a lot of sense here, because the word although indicates that the two ideas presented are contradictory or differ in meaning from one another. So let's nix that. Option C is much too verbose. So let's read it aloud. His Broadway shows are still performed around the world, and they have also remained some of the most beloved and acclaimed productions. So this is essentially just putting the two sentences together, and with the conjunction and, but also with the word also here. I mean, putting it together in this way makes the sentence much too verbose, and it also suggests that they are two completely independent ideas rather than, in fact, very related sentences. This is kind of the function of the word also. So we'll cross that out too. Now, by process of elimination, we've reached D as an answer, but let's explain why we've reached D as an answer. D reads, his Broadway shows are still performed around the world and remain some of the most beloved and acclaimed productions. Notice the word also is absent, which would be too verbose, as we discussed, making D a more concise version. D is our answer. Now let's discuss 13. I'll zoom in here so we can see what's going on. Dancers and audiences alike appreciate productions. I'm sorry, dancers and audiences alike appreciate Robin's work because of their engaging and dramatic style. Now, alike just means both. So we know that plural appreciate needs to be the correct answer here. But let's discuss which words signal singular and which words indicate plural when we're reading these sentences. So let's take a little note here on the side. So if you see none, for example, none of the players, then you would see the plural like along with it. If you see neither, for example, neither of the players, that's accompanied by the singular verb, likes. So none of the players like, neither player likes. The same goes for all and each. All of the players, plural, like. But if you said each of the players, then it would be the singular, likes. So these are some of the key words that you're going to want to commit to memory, because when you see them on the SAT, they will very likely indicate whether you need singular or plural to follow. In this case, the word alike, which simply means both, is presented in question 13 as a means of testing whether you know whether to do singular or plural verb to follow. Okay, so let's move on to question 14 here. Question 14 reads as follows. Robbins was inspired by the American way of life, and he also liked to create pieces that highlighted the vitality and diversity of American culture. Now let's begin by employing the same technique we used in question 12, drawing a dividing line between the two segments of the piece. The first segment reads, Robbins was inspired by the American way of life, and the second reads, and he also liked to create pieces that highlighted the vitality and diversity of American culture. Again, we have to ask ourselves the question, are these 2 points contradictory? And we see that they're not. So the word however, although, would not be appropriate here. Next we ask, are they separate points? For example, if you were to say Robbins was inspired by the American way of life, and Robbins also drew inspiration from his parents, those are 2 separate points. Here we see that these 2 points, Robbins was inspired by the American way of life, and he also liked to create pieces that highlighted the vitality and diversity of American culture, are in fact not separate points. The second is used as evidence for the first. Thus, the answer can't be no change, since the current format of the sentence presents these clauses as 2 totally separate points, as evidenced by the word also. So let's cross out no change here. So, in moving on to option B, we see that a semicolon makes a lot of sense here. Why is that? When do you use a semicolon? Well, a semicolon is essentially used in between 2 closely related independent clauses, in the absence of any kind of conjunction like and or but, etc. So in this case, as we see, they are in fact closely related clauses. Robbins was inspired by the American way of life. Robbins liked to create pieces that highlighted the vitality and diversity of American culture. We see that a semicolon connecting these 2 related clauses makes a lot of sense. So let's put this one on the back burner and look at the other 2 options to make sure that it's in fact the best. Robbins was inspired by the American way of life, liking to create pieces that highlighted the vitality and diversity of American culture. Now, why is C not a good answer? First of all, it sounds extremely awkward, but that's not a substantive enough reason to nix it. In fact, the majority of times when you see a comma and a gerund, the gerund refers to the noun directly before it. Now, liking doesn't correspond with way of life, it corresponds to Robin. So we see a kind of mistaken connection here. So let's cross out C. Remember that when you see this gerund after a comma, you want it to correspond to the noun that comes right before the comma. Now going on to 14D, Robbins was inspired by the American way of life, comma, he liked to create points that highlighted the vitality and diversity of American culture. Now this is a point I really want to highlight. A comma is completely incorrect here. If you change this to a semicolon, it would be correct. But when you have 2 independent clauses, as we are presented here, and no conjunction, notice there's no and, there's no but, you need to have a semicolon or a period to isolate the 2 clauses. A comma does not cut it. So this is an important point that we'll come back to at some point. We see that the answer here is B. Great, so let's go on to number 15. Okay. Number 15 reads as follows. His first work, Fancy Free, was a jazz-inspired ballet about American sailors who enjoy an evening on the town. The two things that we need to recognize here when looking at the question are, first, do we want who, which, or whom? And second, do we want singular, enjoys, or plural, enjoy? So first of all, let's distinguish when you use who, that, and which. Who is used for animate objects, people. So in other words, I know a lot of people who study at Georgetown. That and which are most often used for inanimate objects, but the distinction that you'll most often see on the SAT is who versus which, where who is most often employed for animate objects and which is implied for inanimate. Now let's discuss the difference between who and whom. The simple rule for distinguishing between who and whom is as follows. If you can answer the question with he, then it's who. If you can answer the question with him, then the question word is whom. So the two question words are who and whom. The two answer words are he and him, respectively. So let me give you an example. Who gave you the gift? He did. Whom are you giving a gift? To him. So see this simple distinction? Whenever you see a sentence in which you need to determine whether who or whom is the correct question word used, just think about the answer to that sentence. Would you use he or would you use him? So in this example, let's go back to the actual sentence here for a moment. His first work, Fancy Free, was a jazz-inspired ballet about American sailors who enjoy an evening on the town. So again, it's sailors, so it's animate, so we know who is correct. And sailors is plural, so we know that enjoy has to be in the plural form, so no change here. The distinction who versus whom wasn't particularly relevant to this, but it is an extremely important point that you'll need to know in the writing and language section, and as such I thought it very important to focus on that distinction during this explanation. Okay, let's go on to number 16. Number 16 reads as follows. Seamlessly transitioning between ballet and Broadway, storytelling in any form was Robin's gift. Now, whenever you are presented with a question which begins with a gerund of this type, in other words, the word directly after the comma must be matched with the gerund. This is a really important point to make on the SAT writing and language section, so let's zoom in here. Seamlessly transitioning, identify the gerund. Again, a gerund is just ing. Seamlessly transitioning between ballet and Broadway, storytelling in any form was Robin's gift in the 1950s. So here, you need to determine, well, you need to first identify where the gerund lies and who it's referring to. Who or what? Who is transitioning between ballet and Broadway? Clearly, it's Robbins. Robbins was transitioning between ballet and Broadway. So the word directly after the comma here needs to be Robbins. But it's not. It's storytelling. So we know automatically no change isn't the right answer. Now let's look at the answers here. We know, like I said, that the noun directly after the comma, beginning the second independent clause, needs to correspond to the gerund at the beginning of the sentence. Storytelling, as we just determined, does not correspond to transitioning, and it has to be Robbins. So C is the right answer here. Let me give you another example, as this is such an important point for the SAT writing section. Winning 6 NBA championships, Michael Jordan is often described as the best player of all time. So let's write this out for a moment. Okay, so when you look at a sentence like this, you first need to identify where the gerund is. The gerund is here, winning. Like I said, when it's at the beginning of a sentence like this, and you have a comma before the next clause, the word after the comma needs to correspond to the gerund. What would be incorrect here is winning 6 NBA championships. Critics often call Michael Jordan the best player of all time. Because in that situation, critics would be referring to the winning 6 NBA championships. Those two words would correspond. And that's inaccurate. Great, so let's go on to number 17. In 1957, Robbins choreographed and directed West Side Story, which will become an iconic American musical. So will become implies that right now, in the future, from this point in time, it will become an iconic American musical. We know that's not the case, since in context, it already became an iconic American musical. Have become doesn't make sense because West Side Story is singular. It's a musical. So you could have said had become, which had became, but in fact, have become refers to plural and doesn't make sense here grammatically. So let's go ahead and cross that out. Option C, in 1957, Robbins choreographed and directed West Side Story, which becomes an iconic American musical. So that's present tense. So that also doesn't make sense because we know that it already had to became in the past, leaving us with one option: would become. This is correct. Now, what also would have been correct is went on to become or became. But would become is a sophisticated grammatical construction, which essentially means went on to became. Later became. Would become. Let's go on to 18. I'll have to flip back and forth here. So in 18, let's take a look at our option. Here we go. He became renowned for exploring the limits of dance, music, and drama, and also further experimenting with their boundaries themselves. So instantly when we read this, we think that this is too verbose. Why is that? Also further, that's redundant. These two words essentially mean the same thing. To prove that, you can just cover one of them, cover also, and say, could this sentence work with just further? Exploring the limits of dance, music, and drama, and further experimenting with their boundaries. Yes, it could. Exploring the limits of dance, music, and drama, and also experimenting with their boundaries. Both of these serve the same function in the sentence. Having them both is redundant. So we know that no change doesn't make sense here. So let's go ahead and cross that one out. Okay, now let's look at the other options. The second option for 18 is this: exploring and experimenting with the boundaries of dance, music, and drama. So you might be tempted to pick B. And you might be tempted to do so because it's so concise. The SAT loves conciseness. But here's the issue. Let's reread 18 exactly what it's saying. Jerome Robbins essentially is renowned for exploring the limits of dance, music, and drama, and experimenting with their boundaries. Okay? So he explores the limits of dance, music, and drama, and experiments with their boundaries. Option B muddles the verbs and the nouns used, so that they're all referring to the same thing. Exploring and experimenting with the boundaries of dance, music, and drama. What the sentence actually says is this: explores dance, music, drama. So here's the verb he used. Verb 1, and here are the nouns. Nouns 1. He also experiments with their boundaries. This is the second verb he uses, and the noun he attaches to it. So, when you reformulate this sentence, this first verb, explores, needs to correspond to these three nouns. The second verb he uses, later in the sentence, experiments, must correspond to the second noun he uses, their boundaries. Option B muddles these and essentially throws them all together into a pot. That's not accurately portraying what the author intends to say. Option C, his exploration of dance, music, and drama, and his experimentation with their boundaries. Instantly we can tell that this is what the author is trying to say, but in a more concise way. So option C is the right answer. But just for good measure, let's look at why D is incorrect. Both exploring the limits of dance, music, and drama, and also experimenting with their boundaries. This is just too verbose, simply. Having both and also is not necessary. Remember we discussed earlier how having also and further was redundant. Here, having both and also is also redundant. So let's stick with C. Okay, question 19. Which choice inserted between sentences 2 and 3 would most improve the cohesion of the paragraph? Let's take a look here at 19. Okay, sentences 2 and 3. Inspired by Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, West Side Story explores the conflicts between ethnic groups in New York City and the trials of young love. So that's sentence 2. So we'll isolate sentences 2 and 3. Sentence 3 reads, however, some critics found the elements of dance to be even more compelling than the story itself. Now, those two sentences are not mutually exclusive. They're not explicitly contradictory. They're not particularly differing in meaning. So having the word however here seems very strange. So let's cross off no change in 19, because as it stands, the word however does not make a lot of sense without anything in between sentences 2 and 3. They're not contradictory to one another. So let's look at option B. The music was composed by Leonard Bernstein, and the lyrics were written by Stephen Sondheim. Is there anything in what we just read that would make sentence 3 contradictory to the message in sentence 2 and the interim? Moment, let's find the spot here on the camera. So let me read that again. The music was composed by Leonard Bernstein, and the lyrics were written by Stephen Sondheim. So this essentially does not present any new information that would be contradictory to the fact that some critics found the elements of dance to be even more compelling than the story itself. Because what we were just introduced to was the lyrics and the music. And no sentence that attests to the necessity, quality, or fame of the lyrics and music. Strictly who wrote them, a simple fact. As such, we can go back to B here and cross it out. We don't see anything contradictory in sentence 1 or sentence 2 and the information presented in option B here. Option C reads, the show received praise for its endearing characters and gripping plot. Now we have something we can work with. Let's reread that in the context of sentences 2 and 3. Inspired by Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, West Side Story explores the conflicts between ethnic groups in New York City and the trials of young love. The show received praise for its endearing characters and gripping plot. However, some critics found the elements of dance to be even more compelling than the story itself. This appears instantly to be the right answer. Why is that? It's because option C presents information that speaks to the praise and the quality of the plot itself. And sentence 3 comes in and goes ahead and contradicts that by saying, well, the some critics found the elements of dance to be even more compelling than the story itself. So there's a reason for the however here. It fits in very organically. And again, just reading these sentences in between 2 and 3, you should have a very good sense for what sounds natural. But to give you substantive proof, you can simply appeal to the fact that this sentence presented in option C here is directly contradictory to that in 3, hence the introduction of the word however. Hello again, this is Blake Atherton. I apologize, I ended up cutting the writing and language section short by 3 questions just because of time restrictions. But we will move on now to the reading section of the new SAT, beginning with this passage about the Donner Party moving out to California in the mid-1800s. So before you take a few minutes to read the passage, I want to give you a couple tips on how to best annotate passages in the reading section. So one thing I like to do, and I apologize, this is in pencil so it's kind of hard to see, is I like to underline key phrases, and one thing I like to do at the very beginning of any given passage is mark where the thesis is. So at the beginning of this passage we find the thesis in sentence 3. The members of the far-famed Donner Party are in a peculiar sense pioneer martyrs of California. So this is kind of the major point of the paragraph that will go on to be expanded upon in the next 4 or 5 paragraphs. But if you can identify the thesis, then you know what the main idea of the passage is, and then you kind of have a good sense of what the theme carried throughout each of the paragraphs is going to be. So what other techniques do I use when I'm annotating a piece? Well, one thing I like to do is circle key descriptors. So let's find in paragraph 2 here some of the things that attracted the Donner Party to come out to California. The fruitfulness, the healthfulness, the tropical beauty of the land. These are key adjectives that are used to describe California and the reasons that the Donner Party wanted to come out. So they're descriptors, so I circle them. Another thing I do is key numbers and dates. I put a little square around them. Because oftentimes you'll be tested on your ability to remember key numbers and dates, although they might at the moment seem to be relatively obscure. You do need to remember that, for example, about 100 people, 100 persons is written here, were composed in the original party. This is the type of thing the SAT does indeed test on, to see how deeply you read the passage. So again, I circle descriptors, and I put a little rectangle around key dates and numbers, and underline some of the other key points. But I think the number one thing that I want to express as important about annotation is the fact that you can put a little bracket around paragraphs and give a 3 or 4 word summary of what happens in the paragraphs. So for example, I believe this is paragraph 4 here, which begins with the words, "In the party were aged fathers." Okay? I bracketed this paragraph and wrote the words diversity of crew here. Why did I do that? Because if there's a question given to me later on about what kind of people were in the crew, and basically saying all of these people were found in the Donner Party except, or this particular type of person was found in the Donner Party, I can instantly go back to that section and not waste any time in locating the correct answer with concrete evidence. So as you can see, with this section I have diversity of crew bracketed, and lower I have dangers. So this paragraph has to do with dangers that the Donner Party faced on the road to California. Again, I can't emphasize enough how important this technique is for being able to identify which paragraphs hold which information. Because when you get the questions on the reading section, you want to be able to instantly go back to that paragraph, identify your evidence, and when you have support, select the right answer. So at this time, using the techniques of annotation that I just kind of highlighted, I would like you to go ahead and read the passage once again about the Donner Party, using some of the annotation techniques, and then we'll go ahead and answer the questions in another minute. Okay, so let's begin with some of the questions about this passage on the Donner Party. So the first question reads as follows. It can reasonably be inferred that the conclusions made about the courage of the Donner Party are based on what? Now, whenever you see the words reasonably inferred, What that typically means is you're not going to be able to find the same level of evidence for this that you will for other questions. Reasonably inferred essentially means once you've read the passage and have a good idea of it, what does a sensible person conclude about where the information was gathered from? And you're not necessarily going to be able to point to paragraph 3, sentence 2, in order to provide evidence for this. What we're interested in for historical passages on the SAT is first-hand accounts, and what we're interested in is the most appropriate and feasible first-hand accounts. So let's take a look at the answers. Answer A, journal entries discovered decades later. It looks good. Let's come back to it. Answer B, historical fact that referred to the country's development in the 1840s. So the content of this passage has a lot to do with the courage of the Donner Party, the diversity of the crew, the dangers they faced, the motivation for going out. This has much historical fact sounds too dry, too rigid, and as a matter of fact, too absolute to be the correct answer for this particular type of passage. Option C, first-hand accounts by ancestors of the Donner Party. So, ancestors of the Donner Party would in fact be either secondary or tertiary evidence. It wouldn't be primary sources. We would assume that this scholarly work on the history of the Donner Party is written by primary sources of some sort. This is not a primary source. Option D reads as follows: anecdotal evidence of the group's trip to California. Anecdotal evidence, by contrast to B, sounds a little bit too soft, and it's not primary evidence that we need. We need to figure out what is the most strong and the most appropriate primary sources here. Journal entries discovered decades later is a primary source, and it comes, it's a very reasonably obtained one. Now let's go to question 2. The focus of the passage can be best summarized as a study of both the what? A, Donner Party and the characteristics of the United States in 1846. B, history of the California Gold Rush and the Donner Party. C, Donner Party and the discovery of gold. And D, wealth and innocence of the Donner Party. So let's first look at answer B. History of the Gold Rush and the Donner Party. So now, the Gold Rush was in fact only mentioned once in the piece, and it was explicitly said that the Donner Party moved out before the Gold Rush. But don't believe my words, let's find it for ourselves. Here we see in the first paragraph, the members of this far-famed Donner Party are in a peculiar sense pioneer martyrs of California. Before the discovery of gold, before the highway across the continent was fairly marked out, while untold dangers lurked on the wayside and unnumbered foes awaited for emigrants, the Donner Party started for California. In this sentence, it clearly says that the Donner Party set out for California before gold was ever discovered out there. So, we know from the rest of the piece that the gold rush is not mentioned, and we know in this first sentence that the gold rush was not the reason for the Donner Party to go out. As such, labeling the piece a history of the California gold rush is just blatantly not representative of the actual content. Option C, a study of both the Donner Party and the discovery of gold. Again, for the same reasons that we ruled out B, we can say that the discovery of gold was not a key part of the piece. Option D, wealth and innocence of the Donner Party. So, discussions of wealth are also not found in the piece, whereas innocence you might be able to make a case for in their lack of knowledge of what laid in front of them, here, the cloud of doom. You can't necessarily make a case for the wealth or lack thereof of the Donner Party. This is a very weak answer for which there is little support. A, the Donner Party and the characteristics of the United States in 1846 are strongly supported. And in order to answer that, you really need to be able to point to which specific paragraphs give you that information. And, for example, in the paragraph that I bracketed dangers, this kind of gives a good example of what life was like in 1846 in the United States. Few descriptions had been given of the route, all was novel and unexpected. In later years the road was broadly and deeply marked, blah blah blah. But in 1846, the way was through with almost trackless valleys waving with grass, along rivers where few paths were visible, save those made by the feet of buffaloes and antelope. And it continues on. This entire paragraph essentially gives a description of what America was like in 1846. As we know, descriptions of the Donner Party are rich throughout the entire piece, so A is defensible. Now let's go on to question 3. According to information presented in the passage, which of the following best describes the relationship between the Donner Party and the other American pioneers? A. Other American pioneers also traveled west in search of opportunity. Possibly. B. The Donner Party was one of the first pioneering groups to cross the country to California. We know it was, but we need to find evidence in order to pick that answer. C. The Donner Party ignored the advice of earlier pioneers. I don't remember anything of that sort. D. The Donner Party was successfully reached their destination, while other pioneers did not. Don't specifically remember that. So what these questions will essentially ask you is, what can you find concrete evidence for? Now the trick here is that you'll get a lot of answers that you don't explicitly remember reading. And you want to focus on the ones that you do remember so that you can then find evidence for. So we remember something about the Donner Party being one of the first pioneer groups to cross the country, but we need to prove it. So let's go ahead and follow the star here. So when you read about the Donner Party being one of the first pioneers, you want to go to the first paragraph because it essentially gave a summary of what the Donner Party was. Their impetus for going across the country and their historical significance. That's what the first paragraph introduces. So in the first paragraph, what we see here is, in 1846, comparatively few had dared to attempt to cross the almost unexplored plains which lay between the Mississippi and the fair young land called California. So this gives explicit proof. Comparatively few had dared attempt to cross the almost unexplored plains. In conjunction with this line down here, in 1846, the party set out from Springfield. So we know that at the time that the Donner Party set out to California, it was one of few pioneer groups to do so. This gives explicit proof for option B. Let's go on to question 4. Question 4 asks, according to the passage, the motivation of the Donner Party's journey was to what? So again, we want to look back to the beginning of the passage, because the beginning of the passage essentially states what? The historical significance of the Donner Party, its impetus for going to California, and in general, kind of just a summary of what the party was and what it stood for. So being able to identify that this information comes at the beginning, the first 2 paragraphs of the piece, is key to quickly answering the question. So let's go to the first 2 paragraphs. According to the passage, the motivation of the Donner Party's journey was to what? In the second paragraph, we see the following. In 1846, the party set out from Springfield, Illinois. Okay. What else do we find in this paragraph? The states along the Mississippi were but sparsely settled in 1846, yet the fame and the fruitfulness, the healthfulness, and the almost tropical beauty of the land bordering the Pacific tempted the members of the Donner Party to leave their homes. So here I have what prompted the trip. I have a little note written down by this section, which just in case we get a question about what prompted the Donner Party to leave, we've identified where it is. So it's essentially the beauty of California. So let's look at our answers. According to the passage, the motivation for the Donner Party's journey was to what? Gain independence? Not what it says. Explore the Mississippi? Not what it says here. Flee religious tyranny? Definitely not supported. Reach California? Supported very clearly in the section that I have noted right here. And again, we'll repeat, don't answer a question unless you can point to the proof in the reading. The proof here is this. The fame and fruitfulness, the healthfulness, and the almost tropical beauty of the land bordering the Pacific tempted the members of the Donner Party to leave their homes. That's your proof. The golden rule of the reading section of the SAT is don't answer the question unless you can point to concrete evidence for that answer. Let's go on to number 5. As it is used in the third paragraph, the word unbroken most nearly means what? So here's the trick you want to use for this type of question, which I guarantee will appear on your SAT. In every reading section, it's presented at least once. So let's go to paragraph 5. Here we go. The road was difficult and in places almost unbroken. Warlike Indians guarded the way, and death in 1,000 forms hovered about their march through the great wilderness. So what you want to do, the trick for this type of question, is to essentially take the word unbroken, circle it, and replace it with the options that were given, reading the sentence aloud to see which one makes the most sense. So the road was difficult and in places almost unbroken. What are our answers? The road was difficult and in places intact. Now, not what it means. The road was difficult and in places easy to follow. Quite the opposite. The road was difficult and in places not constructed. The road was difficult and in places well built. So once you take these words and replace them with the word unbroken, you can see very clearly which answer makes the most sense in context. And in context, not constructed, is the most logical answer provided. Now let's finish up with question 6 as presented here. As it is depicted in the passage, the initial mood of the Donner Party can be described as what? So again, we want to use the annotation to very quickly determine where we can find this information. So looking at the passage, where can we locate this kind of information? Something at the beginning of their journey, and I have it starred where their journey began, 1846. So now that you have starred where the journey began, you can essentially locate that and move from there to kind of find the information. So let's focus in on where the journey began, my star here, 1846. Independence was on the frontier in those days, and every care was taken to have ample provisions laid and all necessary preparations made for the long journey. It was a long journey for many in the party. Great was the enthusiasm and eagerness with which these noble-hearted pioneers caught up the cry of the times. Ho for California. Okay, so with that sentence in mind, eagerly determined certainly seems like a good answer. Why? Because we can say, great was the enthusiasm and eagerness with which these noble-hearted pioneers caught up the cry of the times, and we can also say, with the determined portion, that every care was taken to have ample provisions laid and all necessary preparations made for the long journey. That seems like determination, and eagerness is also clearly supported here. So A is a strong front-runner. Hopelessly discouraged, that's quite the opposite of what we found in A. Predominantly cautious. Predominantly indicates that the steps that they took in order to secure, make sure that everything was taken care of for the trip, it predominantly suggests that that was their major descriptor, the most important one. In fact, eagerness was a really, really important component of their attitude at the beginning of this trip. So predominantly is too strong a descriptor here. Wildly happy is also too strong. There's no indication that their eagerness was actually kind of out of control ecstasy. One of the things the SAT really likes to test you on is how well you can craft a reasonable description of a passage. Here, predominantly cautious and wildly happy are just too strong of descriptors to accurately portray what's happening in the passage. And the SAT tests you on whether you can find things that are overly exaggerated, such as these two descriptions, and cross them out because they're not the right answers. A, eagerly determined is what we're interested in here.